James Suckling recently came out with his top 100 wines for 2023. I know Mr. Suckling can be a polarizing figure. Many people believe that his scores are quite inflated, but there's also other people who swear by his recommendations. In any event, Mr. Suckling has been in the business for 40 years, and I've found that in many instances, his identification and discussion of broad trends and themes is oftentimes more insightful than any particular wine review or score that he may have. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing 12 takeaways or observations from Mr. Suckling's top 100 wines of 2023. And be sure to stick around until the end, because after I go through my 12 observations, I'm going to reveal the 2 wines from Mr. Suckling's list that I think offer the best quality to price ratio for wine collectors. My first observation from reviewing James Suckling's top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that Mr. Suckling is not at all shy about awarding perfect 100-point scores. Out of the 39,000 wines that he and his team reviewed for 2023, 50 of them received perfect 100-point scores. So while Mr. Suckling could have included 50 perfect wines in his top 100 list, he only included 17 of them. This was so because Mr. Suckling excluded wines that cost more than $400 from his list for 2023. Compare this to Wine Spectator, for example, which had 0 100-point wines in the Wine Spectator top 100 list for 2023. So certainly Mr. Suckling seems far more willing to award perfect scores and very high scores than do at least some of his competitors. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that the geographic areas in which he finds compelling values in wine have shifted. In the past, Mr. Suckling said that he found some of the best value in countries like Spain and also in South America generally. But unfortunately, Mr. Suckling notes that South American wine prices have doubled, and Spanish wine prices are up substantially as well. And he also mentioned that Italy has also raised prices quite a bit. Instead, Mr. Suckling noted that he's currently finding the best values in countries like Germany, Austria, and New Zealand. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that France was a huge winner in 2023, with almost 1/3 of the list. France had 33 wines on James Suckling's top 100 list this year. A large number of those wines are from Bordeaux, and this was due to the strength of the 2020 vintage in Bordeaux and the large number of Bordeaux wines that appear on Mr. Suckling's list. But Mr. Suckling also enjoyed champagne in 2023, and there's a number of prominent champagne producers on his list as well, including the #1 overall wine, Laurent Perrier's Grand Siècle, number 26, as well as Dom Pérignon Rosé, Cru Grand Cuvée, and some others. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's list of top 100 wines for 2023 is that Italy also did extremely well, with 17 of the top 100 wines. One big reason for Italy's strong performance was the outstanding 2019 vintage for Brunello di Montalcino. In fact, Mr. Suckling had at least 5 wines from Brunello di Montalcino on his list, and they were either from the strong 2019 vintage or the equally strong 2016 vintage. This is a stark contrast from the Wine Spectator list, which actually awarded the #1 overall wine of the year to a Brunello from the 2018 vintage, which Mr. Suckling described as being, quote, slightly meager, close quote. I, for one, am extremely excited about the 2019 Brunello di Montalcino wines. Unfortunately, if you're a fan of Brunello, you'll need to have a little bit of patience as they are not released until 2024. Fortunately, however, in another couple weeks, I will be attending a Brunello di Montalcino tasting where I'll be able to sample a large number of these 2019 Brunello di Montalcino wines that will be released next year. Once I'm finished with that tasting, I'll of course be preparing a video to share my thoughts regarding the vintage generally, as well as some of the wines that I think you might want to keep an eye out for. So be sure to stay tuned for that. My next takeaway from reviewing James Suckling's list of top 100 wines for 2023 is that $100 will not buy you what it used to. In fact, the average price of the wines on Mr. Suckling's top 100 list in 2023 is $140 per bottle. Notably, however, this was down a bit from last year when the average was $200 per bottle. And in part, this reduction is due to the fact that this year, Mr. Suckling excluded wines that cost more than $400 from his list. In contrast, last year, he had a number of extremely expensive wines on his list, such as Penfolds Grange and some extremely high-priced Bordeaux, for example. The next takeaway from my review of James Suckling's Top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that unlike the 2022 list, this year the United States was a big loser. Last year, the United States had an impressive 28 wines on Mr. Suckling's list. In contrast, this year there's only 6 wines from the United States on Mr. Suckling's Top 100 list. So certainly a very poor performance by the United States. And in fact, there's also not even one Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon on this list. A large part of that is due to the fact that there were some fires on the West Coast in 2020, and so for that reason, it was extremely difficult for a number of the wines in California, Washington, and Oregon to have strong vintages in 2020. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's Top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that Bordeaux was incredibly strong and had outstanding representation on this list. In fact, almost 20% of the list is Bordeaux. Specifically, I counted 19 Bordeaux, including 1 white wine and 1 Sauterne, so there were 17 red wines from Bordeaux, including some of my favorites, such as Pontet-Canet, Lynch-Bages, Domaine du Chevalier, and many more. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's Top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that Mr. Suckling loves him some Riesling. While the total number of Rieslings on this year's list is a bit lower than last year's list, there's still an impressive 11% of this year's list devoted to Riesling. And of course, there's some of the usual suspects on this list from Germany, Austria, and Alsace, France. And interestingly, Mr. Suckling also opines that, in his view, some of the very best values in the world of wine are some of the single vineyard Rieslings that are included in his list. So if you're a fan of high-end Riesling, be sure to check out some of the names and do some research for some potential additions to your collection. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. My next takeaway from the James Suckling Top 100 Wines of 2023 is that, like the Wine Spectator list, there's a number of wines on the James Suckling list that I've recommended on this channel. Examples include Pontet-Canet, Lynch-Bages, Domaine du Chevalier, La Rioja Alta, FX Pichler, Rudy Pichler, Ornellaia, Marqués de Murrieta, Contino, and many more. The next takeaway from my review of James Suckling's Top 100 Wines from 2023 is that once again, Rhone Wines are given short shrift by Mr. Suckling. Last year, there were only 2 wines from the Rhone that were in Mr. Suckling's Top 100, and one of them was from the Northern Rhone and one from the South. That's unfortunately the sad state of affairs for the 2023 list as well. And in fact, Mr. Suckling didn't even bother to change the wine from the Northern Rhone that was on his list. Rather, he just updated the vintage. And again, there's just 1 wine from the Southern Rhone as well. Personally, I'd like to see Mr. Suckling focus a little bit more closely on at least the Northern Rhone, but certainly the Southern Rhone as well, as there's some outstanding wines coming out of both of these parts of France. And certainly with 33 out of the top 100 wines in France, there could be a little bit more diversity with the wines from France that are being considered by Mr. Suckling. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's Top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that Mr. Suckling is most definitely not on Team ABC, or anything but Chardonnay. There were 8 Chardonnays on Mr. Suckling's list this year, which is certainly an impressive showing for Chardonnay. 2 of these Chardonnays were actually from Napa Valley. So it's certainly quite unusual for Napa Valley to have 0 Cabernet Sauvignons on the top 100, but 2 Chardonnays. But that's where we find ourselves for 2023. My next observation from reviewing James Suckling's top 100 list of wines for 2023 is that Australia was also a big loser, just like the United States. And in fact, there's only one Australian wine on James Suckling's 2023 top 100 list. Australia thus has the same number of wines on this list as countries like China, Hungary, and Portugal. So certainly a very disappointing showing for Australian wines this year as well. Having gone through my list of 12 observations from James Suckling's top 100 list of wines for 2023, it's now time for me to reveal what I think are the very best values from that list. The first of which is the 2020 Domaine de Chevalier Pessac Léognan. Domaine de Chevalier is classified in the Graves classification. This impressive wine was given a 97-point score by Mr. Suckling, but it also received that same impressive 97-point score from critics such as Robert Parker, Jeb Dunnock, and Wine Enthusiast. So the reviews of this wine were pretty consistent across the board. Domaine de Chevalier for 2020 is 65% Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's around 27% Merlot, and there's also Petit Verdot and Cabernet Franc in the blend. This impressive wine is one that you will need to set down for a few years, however, and I recommend that you give it at least 7 or 8 years before you start digging in, and it will certainly have a long life ahead of it and last several decades after that. This wine is an absolutely incredible value for the price, and you should be able to find it in the $70 to $80 range if you shop around. Despite the fact that Bordeaux was somewhat weak in 2021, Domaine de Chevalier was also somewhat of an outlier that vintage and made an excellent 2021. And I also have recommended the 2022 futures for Domaine de Chevalier on this channel as well. So this is a wine that I like consistently, pretty much year in and year out. The next top value from James Suckling's top 100 list of 2023 is the 2015 La Rioja Alta Gran Reserva 904 Selección Especial Rioja Tinto. La Rioja Alta makes a number of impressive wines that I enjoy, but the 904 has historically been my favorite. 904 is made in a classic style. This wine ages in barrel for 4 years and spends another 4 years in bottle before it's released. This wine is 90% Tempranillo and 10% Graciano. This vintage is the first one for which La Rioja Alta used an optical sorting machine. The optical sorting equipment resulted in there being a more strict selection of fruit for the 904 for the 2015 vintage. When I did a tasting with the winemaker at La Rioja Alta, he advised that this resulted in a much higher quality wine for the 2015 vintage. And in fact, this vintage is one that he describes as being the best 904 in decades. And indeed, this was the very first time that the 904 has ever received the Selección Especial designation from La Rioja Alta, which is a designation that La Rioja Alta uses very sparingly and only when there's a wine produced that's so exceptional that it must be celebrated. This wine would have ordinarily been released in 2022, but the winery held it back for an additional year because the wine was not very expressive at the time that it would ordinarily have been released. And this is partly due to the fact that it has more structure and concentration than most 904s. And this is a sign that it's going to be a very long-lived wine. I recently revisited this wine a few weeks ago, and indeed it's still drinking incredibly youthfully, despite the fact that it has 8 years of age already. And it also had a fair amount of new oak influence yet. So this is one I would definitely recommend putting away for a number of years before you start digging in. This wine sells for around $90 per bottle. While you're at it, if you're looking for this wine, I would also keep an eye out for the 2011 904. That was the most recent release prior to this 2015 vintage. You can probably find the 2011 904 for quite a bit less than the 2015. And that one is a wine that's drinking extremely well now. So what I would recommend is that you enjoy the 2011 904 in the near term while you're waiting on your 2015 904s to age.